We would now like to begin with our first panel for the day. Celebrate the grand narratives of Indian mythology. We have with us Mr. Amish Tripathi and our Honorable Chairman, Mr. Subhash Ghai, and moderating the session we have Mr. Chaitanya Chinchlekar. Amish Tripathi is a recognized contemporary Indian fiction writer, best known for writing the Shiva trilogy. He is very well known for his books, The Immortals of Meluha, The Secret of the Nagas, The Oath of the Vayuputras, Sion of Ikshvaku, Sita, Warrior of Mithila, Ravan, Enemy of Aryavarta, and Legend of Sohaildev, the king who saved India. His debut novel, Immortals of Meluha, made a record breaking sale within a few weeks of its launch, making him an internationally acclaimed Indian author. Moreover, Dharma Productions of the Indian film industry has recently bought the film rights for The Immortals of Meluha. He was also listed among the 50 most powerful Indians by India Today in 2019. It's a privilege to have you with us today, sir. We also have with us founder and chairman of Whistling Woods International and Mukta Arts, the showman of the Indian film industry, Mr. Subhash Ghai. Mr. Subhash Ghai is a globally renowned filmmaker, having written and directed 19 films over a 4-decade career, 14 of them being blockbusters, and 40 feature films as producer under his corporate film company, Mukta Arts Limited. Recipient of many national and international awards, he has also been honored by the United States Senate. He has been the former chairman of the Entertainment Committee of trade body CII and also a member of FICCI, NASSCOM, and Thai Global and its alliances. He is a member of the Executive Committee of the Producers Guild of India and a member of the United Producers Forum, and has been appointed as a member of the Steering Committee of the International Film Festival of India by Ministry of Information and Broadcast. He has been invited to address various forums and seminars on corporate governance and the growth of the media and entertainment industry globally and in India. He is presently serving as the chairman of Media and Entertainment Skill Council India and launched an initiative, Vidya Dan Movement, with its mission to reconnect Guru and Shishya beyond formal education so experts may share the wisdom with each and every student in urban and rural areas. Having made many short films and music videos for social causes include Skill India, Kumbh 2019, Tree Plantation, Clean Ganga, Gandhi, A Perspective, and a music video especially made for the Election Commission in 2019. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he has written and composed 12 songs for social causes, 25 poems, and 3 film scripts. He recently launched Audious Tracks under the Mukta Arts banner, which is to promote upcoming talents in the field of content creation, acting, and music. And through this, introduced a lot of songs on social causes, which have been sung and performed by the new talents from the School of Music under his guidance. During the lockdown, he has been felicitated and appreciated as a COVID warrior by the honorary government of Maharashtra and Sapandan Arts for his music and videos to inspire the people of India. Moderating the session, we have Mr. Chaitanya Chinchlekar, the Vice President of Business Development and the Chief Technology Officer of Whistling Woods International, and the Vice President of Strategy at Mukta Arts Limited. Over the past decade at Whistling Woods, he has undertaken several path-breaking efforts to revolutionize the mainstream film and media education. That has included partnerships with several global M&E giants, Sony, Google, Apple, Adobe, Fraunhofer, Red Cameras, and many more, to set up R&D education industry co-working partnerships. He has also been instrumental in the one key partnership between Whistling Woods International and the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, which has brought about the mainstreaming of film and media education in India by launching India's first undergraduate applied arts degree programs in filmmaking, acting, and music. He is also an active speaker at seminars and conferences on multiple topics related to education and the film, media, and entertainment industry. He is part of the advisory team of the National Skills Development, Media, and Entertainment Skill Council. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kabir. Thank you, Amish, for being here. Thank you, Subhaji. So, this was an excellent opportunity that we have, where we have 2 stalwarts, both who are great storytellers as well as know how to build a grand narrative. One with words and audio visual. And soon the one with words will also be moving into the audio visual area. But, before we get into that, I want to just set up the session. So, we have some understanding of what it is that we're actually talking about. So even though we have centuries of stories in our country, in our civilizational nation that we have, our film industry is in the 107-year-old industry, has taken some of them and has portrayed them on the audiovisual medium, has also borrowed a lot from the grand narratives of Indian mythology and used them in several of our films. And the grand structure of our narratives has flown into the narratives of our audiovisual content as well, right? However, there are areas that historically we have used in our storytelling, which we have yet to codify and present to the world in a more academic format, right? If, for example, if you ask about screenwriting, everybody still talks about the 3-act structure, which is a more Greek structure, but nobody talks about the 5-act structure, which is a historically, like a civilizationally an Indian narrative structure. So how do we take that? How do we codify it and kind of present it to the world as another way of storytelling? You know, similarly, if you look at some of our grand narratives, we have everything that are there in today's content. You have spin-offs, you have branching narratives which come together in the end. Mahabharata is a great example of both. You have, the narratives are based on a grand scale, both across time. So they span, in some cases centuries, in some cases tens of decades, and also visually, right? If you try and when you read the stuff and you imagine how it is, it's an extremely visually rich medium. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of these and how our cinema has been influenced by the grand narratives, and how do we make sure that we are able to take these narratives of Indian mythology and present it to the world better. So with that set up, I want to, kind of get things going by asking Amish something, right? So, we've had, what you write is maybe can be best described as mythology fiction or fiction history, or, we've had some of that in the past, but a lot of what we see in your books and what we read in your books, right? It triggers the imagination center of the brain very differently from, what some of the other material has. So when you write, do you write just narratively, or do you write audiovisually? Is there audiovisual in your head when you write?
Very good question. I have to admit I'm an instinctive writer. So I don't, I don't make flow charts and a story flow. And, in fact, when I did my first book, Immortals of Meluha, which was, I would have started writing it in 2004, 2005. I'd written no fiction before that, absolutely nothing. Right? I knew in school, college, I was a completely left-brained guy. I graduated in mathematics. You don't get more left-brained than that. And then I did an MBA and then worked in banking for 14 years. I was always a voracious reader. I read a lot, but I never did any creative writing, no fiction writing. I didn't learn it formally. I read self-help books before I wrote Immortals of Meluha, and they were all useless. Because I tried to follow some of those techniques, they didn't work. So how it works for me is, I know it sounds strange, but it truly is like there is a parallel universe which I see when I write, and I describe what I see. And in many ways, you're saying that it's a bit like an audio visual. It's even deeper, because to me, that world is more real than the world that we live in right now. Right now, I can see you guys. I can hear you when you speak, but I can't hear your thoughts. I can't feel your emotions. But when I'm in that parallel universe of the books that I write, I can hear the thoughts of the characters. I can feel their emotions. I cry with them. I laugh with them. So in a sense, it's a bit like there is a blessing, and I have to open myself up to that blessing to allow me to enter that universe. The ancient Greeks used to say that the genius is not something that exists inside of you. The genius is actually a goddess, a muse that exists outside of you. and your task is to help the goddess to help you, right? Which means open yourself up for that blessing, let it flow, and then write it. That's how I write. So it's completely instinctive, right? There is some parts of it which are thought through and planned. So for example, all my stories, I write in the traditional Indian storytelling style, not the Persian storytelling style or the Greek storytelling style, where the philosophies are not necessarily that important. Like in the Persian storytelling style, at the center of almost every type of story is different facets of love. Bollywood is also influenced a lot by the, by the Persian storytelling style, different facets of love. The traditional Indian storytelling style, at the core, is always an answer to a question: what is dharma? Usually, the core of any traditional Indian storytelling style is always some philosophies, and the story is a wrapper to convey those philosophies. So those philosophies I think about. I read a lot. I debate a lot with my family, who I respect a lot. With Subhashji, whenever I meet, he's also a philosopher. So I like chatting with him and listening to him because I learn philosophies, which will then go on to my story, right, somewhere. So that is the core. But how the wrapper comes, it's completely instinctive. And I know this doesn't help your students that much. It might appear like it's not helping your students that much, but because the problem is in today's education system, we have been trained to think that, bhai, algo kya hai? Steps kya hai? Which is a very Western process. That's not the way it works. And that works for some things. Works for MBA, works for maths. It's not something that works in the creative space, in the spiritual space. In the traditional Indian storytelling way, in the Indian education system, you train your left brain, you train your right brain as well, your instinctive part. Okay. So where you don't learn steps, what you do is you train it to become efficient, which is do painting, sing, do anything creative, because that trains your right brain. And then it's able to just receive blessings of creativity. Okay. So that's what I try and do. I travel a lot. I listen to music. I do fun, creative things which trains the right brain. And then when I have to write, I open the laptop, wait for Lord Shiva to send the blessing. And he sends it.
That's a good one. So just, before I come to SG, I just want to kind of, dig a little bit deeper on one thing that you mentioned, right? Where it's almost like when you go into the parallel universe, you hear the thoughts of the characters, right? Is because in the parallel universe, is it because you are all the characters yourself in the parallel universe? Or is it because you've seen and you've read so much about so many of these characters that you kind of know them without knowing them?
Again, very good question. I think in some ways, I am all the characters in there because I feel their emotions deeply. When I wrote, or rather when it came to me, the death scene of Devi Sati in both of the Vayuputras, I couldn't do anything for 2 days after that. I was so disturbed, when I wrote it. And I remember I was in my study when I wrote it. At that time I was still married, so I went to the bedroom. My wife was sitting on the bed reading a book. I lay down on the side and I just said, she's dead. And I started crying. And I put my head on her lap and I was just crying because I was just so disturbed. The fact that she died and the magnificent manner that she died. All of us are going to die. Okay. But it's a manner of our death which makes it memorable. The magnificent manner in which she died impacted me so deeply. So in some ways I am all those characters. In some ways I'm a fly on the wall who's just watching all of them, which is why I love writing so much. I've written 8 books in 10 years. That's a pretty fast pace. And all of them are reasonably long books. They are 400, 500 pages. They take a lot of research. And, I would love to say I'm this brilliant, hardworking guy who's able to pull it through. No, it's actually, it's like a drug. I want to be in that parallel universe all the time because I love it so much. I love just being there because it is almost like a spiritual experience, being there. And if you can get into that space as a creative person, where you're not doing it because you want to be famous. You're not doing it because you want to make money. Those things are good side effects. I'm not denying that. Where you're just doing it because you just love being in that world so much that you'd rather do that than anything else. And that is the beauty of that, of seeing characters, seeing a universe that you're just so fascinated by it. You just like spending time there. And then stories just come. That's how it comes to.
Nice. Lovely. So, Subhaji, with you also, I mean, if there is one thing that everybody knows about you is how you mount your films and how you mount your narratives on this extremely grand scale. So, obviously, when the first one you were planning, which is Kali Charan, and then in the first production Cars, did you always decide that this is how I'm going to make it grand, or this is just natural to you and it just kept flowing naturally? And that's one part. The second part is, did you, because I know even you have read a lot of in Indian history, a lot of Indian mythology, how much of that automatically came into your writing and your filmmaking?
Thank you, Amish. Thank you, CC, for calling me here. You see, today I am very much interested in this session because Amish Tripathi is here. And secondly, I am most interested is because a subject which has been always in my mind since my childhood is called mythology. Mythology. And it has been our part of life, right from our childhood till now. Whatever we work, whether we are scientists, we are lawyer, doctor, cinema maker. So even you see in my work also, there are god and goddesses over there. There are narratives which are the expressions of many god and goddesses. जब हमको कोई सीन गिरते हुए लगता है तो हम भगवान का नाम ले देते हैं या भगवान को दिखा देते हैं वहाँ पर, और वहाँ पर वो हमको गॉड बचा लेता है. So this is a very blessed power around us. We live within. But my question, my being here with Amish, with the students of cinema and the students who are watching this program, I would like to ask few questions to Amish. Amish Tripathi is, of course, a pride of India, a great storyteller who connects modern to the ancient expression of human life and the whole universe. He is a person who triggers the young mind in the world. That's the best thing in Amish. He has written 8 books in 10 years. But what books? 8 books in 100 years, I would say. No, he will write at least 40 books in 100 years. His narrative on gods and goddesses are so different that takes you to a different perspective altogether. Because his left brain genius and right brain genius both work, I think, simultaneously. I would say. But myself being a student of drama and cinema, so I'm the keen learner of the Indian epics. And I'm a very instinctive thinker and a narrator and receiver. I have read as everybody has read, because India is an epical country. India, people are epics. Unke naam bhi samke Ram, Krishna, Sita, Radha, सबके नाम जो थे, हम लोगों ने भगवान के नाम ही रखे हुए हैं. But few things which is in my mind as a student, I would like to ask. Apart from this epics like Ram, Mahabharata and Ramayana, and many mythological books like Matsya, Kalki, Dashavatara, Vishnu, you see. So, who wrote all these books? Who were the people who could write all this in a different narrative altogether? Ramayana, Mahabharata speaks something as a probably say history, or is with the living creatures, or the living human beings. Where the other books are Vishnu, Brahma, Mahesh. They are mythology, right? Mythology is a myth. So I always think it's a myth. Myth means vaham hai, ye hai nahi, ye real nahi. So I would like you to enlighten our students. What is mythology? What is the myth? Is it real? Or it is a brainchild of some genius of that time, 5,000 years, 4,000 years, who wrote all about this? Who created these people in their books? Mahesh, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Who was a man? He must be a writer who could take a pen. he must be having a parents who must have educated him. His parent must be having some parents. So what was that era where we were living in that civilization, where his writer could write something, such a strange narrative that will survive for another 4,000 years and 5,000 years, and it will become the part of the South Asian world, rather, psychology and human behavior. So please do answer me the difference between the epics and the mythology, and what is mythology first? Please.
Very, very good question, Subhashji, and I will answer this at 3 levels.
Okay, sir.
One, I think one of the key things that, the way our history books are written, which they don't teach us,
yes,
is that India is the only surviving pre-Bronze Age culture. The only one. Every Bronze Age was 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? China is not pre-Bronze Age. China is some 2,500 to 3,000 years old. China probably began its life around 1000 BCE. India is pre-Bronze Age, which means minimum 3000 BCE. Okay, and there were cultures which began at that time. Pharaonic Egypt, Mycenae, which was a mother culture of Greece, Gilgamesh, Mesopotamia. There are a few cultures, and India. Okay, began at that time. The only one that is still alive till today is India. Right? So there are Shivlingas which have been discovered in Rakhi Gadi, which is an Indus Valley city site, or in Hariuppa. Right? The Yagna platforms that are there have been discovered in Rakhi Gadi. So rituals which go back at the minimum 5,000 years, probably a lot longer, maybe 7,000, 8,000 years old, are still being followed till today. Till today, there are Lord Shiva worshippers, as I am.
Why so? Why is a question.
Yeah. So that is one aspect. The result of that is that our stories are so ancient, unlike any other culture in the world. See, UK, I'm sitting in the UK right now. US is how long? 300 years old. UK is how old? 1,000, 1,500 years old. Right? Our culture is so old, it's so ancient, and the only one that is still alive, that very few can know for sure how did it all begin. Because it is so ancient. Right? That's the first part. The second part, what our traditions say. Who wrote the Ramayana and the Mahabharata? Ramayana was written by Valmiki ji, Mahabharata was composed by Ved Vyas ji, Ganesh ji wrote it. But Ved Vyas is actually a title. Right? His name was Krishna Dwaipaya. Every age has a Ved Vyas. Every age has a Ved Vyas. The one who compiles the Vedas for that age becomes the Ved Vyas for that age. So the Ved Vyas of our age, his name was Krishna Dwaipaya. So why is he called Ved Vyas? Because he compiled the Vedas for our age. He also composed the Mahabharata. He also composed the Mahapuranas. All the Linga Puran, Vishnu Puran, Brahma Puran. He's composed all of them, Ved Vyas. Now, so this is what our traditions say. Then the question that arises, is it mythology or history? Like I said, one of the key things which anyone and no one in the world can be sure of, because India is so ancient, no one can be 100% sure. Okay, but let me address this question of history and mythology. Because the debate arises, this belief that history is truth and mythology ये वहम है, untruth है, मैं तो मानो या जो मान रहे हैं वो बेवकूफ लोग हैं. That is the belief. That is there. That is
Andhavishwasi.
Andhavishwasi. That is what is told. Correct. When the bizarre thing is actually in the Indian way and in the dharmic way, Vishwas has never been important. It is dharma which is important. You can be an atheist and still be a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Sikh. It doesn't matter whether you have faith or not. What matters is, are you with dharma or not? Right? But coming back, history and mythology. History claims it's the truth. Mythology claims it's the untruth. In Sanskrit or in Hindi or in any Indian language, we never use the term mithya. We use the term itihasa, which literally means thus it happened. Itihasa. Thus it happened. Our ancestors used to say, no one can be sure what the one truth is. If anyone is claiming that he knows what the one truth is, he's either a liar or a fanatic. No one can be sure what the one truth is. You can just be sure of your truth. So I can be sure of my truth. How can I be sure of what your truth is? And if I try and force my truth on you, then I'm a fanatic. Okay, if I say my truth is the one truth, and if you don't believe in this one truth, you will go to hell and burn for eternity, then I'm a fanatic. That's what our ancestors used to say. We must respect someone else's right to have their truth. Is this possible in history as well? Let me give you an example. I'm in London. In London, in UK, Winston Churchill is a hero. Right? Rightly so, as I always say, because he defended England from the attack of the Nazis, so the British see him as a hero. We Indians see Winston Churchill as a monster. He killed 3 million Indians in a man-made famine that he ordered. Again, it is not taught in our history books. Winston Churchill ordered a famine in India in 1942 as a scorched earth policy to stop the Japanese army. In that man-made famine that he ordered, 3 million Indians died. Okay, how many Indians did Hitler kill? No one. How many Indians did Winston Churchill kill? 3 million. So for us Indians, Winston Churchill is a bigger monster than Hitler, logically. Now, whose truth is the truth? Is the British truth right or is our truth right? Why, the obvious answer is both truths are right from different perspectives. From our perspective, Indian perspective, Winston Churchill is a monster. From the British perspective, Winston Churchill is a hero. Itihasa is a mature adult which accepts that there are multiple truths. There is your truth, there is my truth. This history mythology debate is a very silly Western idea which emerges only when you think there is one truth. And history is one truth, mythology vahm hai. This entire debate itself is nonsense, the way our ancestors thought.
I agree.
This debate arises of history and mythology only when someone has the fanaticism to claim that there is one truth and my truth is the one truth. And if you don't follow this one truth, you'll go to hell. That is fanaticism. Indians were never fanatics. So the point is not whether our stories are history or mythology. The point is the question itself does not arise in our way. We call it itihasa. The debate is beyond this. The debate is about what is your truth.
What it derives me, it gives me a point to share with my students and all the younger generation. Please understand what the Mamishi is saying is that there is not one truth. I also read somewhere, if you correct me if I'm wrong, that there are 257 truths in this world. 257 truths belonging to different land, culture, people. Because everybody's truth is a different than other. So what is more important for us to understand is that we must respect others' perspective because this is his truth. So
and
what
that's where we become good storytellers. Yeah.
We should respect the perspective of other persons. We should not be stubborn enough that no, you are wrong, I'm right. Both can be right because both have a different drishtikon, this perspective. And if you want a life, harmony and happiness in life, this is very important principle that you must follow it, that respect every perspective and every truth, because truth varies from people to people, situation to situation, time to time. And that is why our mythology has one thing very constantly. He says कि वेद व्यास हर आदमी compile करता गया और वो मालिक बनता चला गया. There was nothing constant. They were always changing. They were always changing. That is the beauty of our mythology. It is the beauty of our the whole culture part of it. Thank you for the enlightening of these questions. Very, very beautiful. And I would like you to define one thing, one word more. The basic. जैसे mythology के बारे में आपने कहा. What is blessings? How would you define blessings in a modern world to the younger generation?
Very good question. That's why I love talking to you, Subhashji, because you ask very intelligent questions. Because the word that is used in the Indian way for blessings is Ashirvada, right? and Vad is speech, right? Essentially.
Yeah.
When you receive a blessing from someone, because one of the things in the ancient Indian way is that there is no judgment. Even God doesn't judge you.
Yeah.
You have your own, for the want of a better term, I'll use a modern term, you have your own balance sheet, right? And you create that balance sheet over different lifetimes through your karma. You do good karma, you get assets on that balance sheet.
Ji.
You do bad karma, you get liabilities on that balance sheet. And if you have done bad karma, God can't come and save you just because you worship Him. Aisa nahi hai. When you worship God, you're just asking for help to do your karma better. Right? Your main thing that matters is your karma. Right? And the belief used to be that when you give an ashirvad, right, you are essentially using your good karma to pass it on to someone else. Right? To pass on those blessings to someone else. So if your karma is very powerful, like say Ma Gandhari, who was a human being,
Ji.
right? When she gave blessings, her blessing was more powerful than the word of a god like Lord Krishna in the Mahabharata. Think of the deep philosophy that our ancestors were telling us, that if your karma is good, a human being will deserve respect even from God.
Yes.
Right? And so when we say that, for example, you're touching the feet of your elders and they are blessing you, the way to understand is actually we are not demeaning ourselves by touching them. In fact, the elders are doing us a favor by using their good karma to wish good for us. Because instead of using their good karma for themselves, they are wishing good for us. So if you see it from the perspective of a transaction, beneficiary कौन है भाई? Beneficiary is the younger person. मैं पाँव छू रहा हूँ, आप बड़े हो, आपके अच्छे कर्म के द्वारा मुझे बेनिफिट मिलेगा, तो भाई बेनिफिशियरी तो मैं हूं. So when you're showing respect to your elders, you're actually a beneficiary. That is the traditional greeting, which is why you'll find in the Indian way, when you give charity, the person giving charity will be grateful to the person receiving charity. It's ulta in the Indian way. It's written clearly in the Mahabharata. The person giving charity will say thank you to the person receiving charity. जैसे पुराने जमाने में सन्यासी आते थे, you would give them food. You'd be very clear that that sannyasi is doing you a favor by taking the daan from you. Why? Because that sannyasi's good karma will help you. So therefore, in the Indian tradition, the person giving charity has to be grateful to the person taking charity from him, because my bad karma is being wiped out by that person's blessing. So our entire transaction is about, it becomes ulta. The person helping should be grateful. Supposedly helping should be helpful. Grateful.
When you say
just as you one small, so a lot of these things that you spoke about, whether it is understanding that multiple roads to the truth, or multiple truths, or multiple aspects of the way people look at truth, or what you spoke about right now, which is trying to understand how how blessings are. A lot of this, it should actually be foundational education.
I
right?
completely agree with you.
Right? It should be maybe 4th grade.
Yeah.
At that level, if not higher.
Chaitanya, completely
how
agree
do we
with
do
you.
that? How do we codify this? What you're talking?
Completely agree with you.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what the problem is.
How do we codify it? That's the thing.
The problem is this, that you'll see, if we are disconnected from our culture, you'll see in Burma, when the military junta had withdrawn from power, just Google it up, read the articles. There are various people, this was many years ago, there are various people protesting against the military. The protest which had the most power is when the monks stopped taking bhiksha from the military. They stopped taking arms. Okay. And the military was so shocked, the soldiers, that the monks aren't taking our daan anymore. And daan kya? You're giving some food. Okay. That it shocked them enough that they decided that we have to step back. Can you imagine? So the Burmese are connected to their culture. because this makes sense only with those people who are actually in the Indic mind frame. Otherwise, if you come to the West, you know, they'll say someone is refusing to taking food. How is that a protest? They'll say he's a beggar not taking food from you. What's the big deal? Correct. Whereas in the Indian way, you will get shocked. The sannyasi is refusing to take food from you. How bad must I be? Right? Burma is connected to its culture in that sense. India is not. Biggest problem is our education system.
Yeah. So
the British set up a colonial education system, and the entire aim of which is हम सबको किसी भी तरह अंग्रेज बना दो साथ में. Okay, we teach nothing about our culture, nothing. In every subject, I'm not just talking about spirituality. Let's be honest, even yoga, it has become cool now because Americans have started doing yoga. I come from a family where yoga was, you know, we practiced yoga from a young age. But I know there was a time when we would be called Punga Pandits for doing yoga. But now Americans are doing it, so it's cool. Haldi doodh, if your grandmother tells you to drink it, it's good for COVID, good against fever, you'll not drink it. But when you know, Starbucks or someone will say turmeric latte, you know, and bill you some 500 rupees for it, you'll very happily drink it. Because we don't have confidence in our own culture. We don't teach our own culture at our education system. This, all of us need to demand it from our government. Teach our culture in our education system.
On that bit, right? On that bit, so say assuming somebody wanted to actually codify a lot of these, this is values, this is virtues and values essentially. If you had to codify it and put it into a, I mean, for lack of a better word, textbook or a teaching methodology that was taught to say an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, because you know that's the right age probably at which to introduce it. How would one go about doing, how would you codify it? You'd essentially have to, you know, bottle up or, you know, type out what you just said for the last 15 minutes and that becomes one chapter.
No, what right do I have to enforce my point of view?
No, I'm just saying, how do you codify this?
How our Gurukuls used to do it. Okay, and the Gurukuls were there till there's this beautiful book called, wonderful book called Beautiful Tree. Okay, written by Dharampal ji. It's available for free on the internet. It's out of copyright. He was a Gandhian. You should read it. And he has studied British Raj era records to show what our education system was like before the British destroyed it through their taxation policies. We are told that the British built our education system. Total nonsense. We had our own education system. Gurukuls, Pathshalas and Madrasas in almost every village. And we had Gurukuls, Pathshalas, Madrasas in every village. We had colleges attached to temples and great universities in towns like Nalanda, Takshashila. Those were destroyed in the Turkic invasions. Bakhtiyar Khilji destroyed Nalanda, for example, Nalanda University. There were so many books in the library that apparently the library burned for 2 months when Bakhtiyar Khilji set fire to it. God knows how much knowledge was lost. This was our education system. You study Beautiful Tree. He also says, Dharampal ji, what the curriculum was like. Okay. And among the foundational things which everyone was taught, Ramayana, Mahabharata, mathematics. Okay. Our ancestors believe everyone has to know maths properly. Everyone. Okay. Because that's a foundation. Yeah? These 3 subjects were the beginning. Okay. Ramayana, Mahabharata is not just philosophies. You like the Shanti Parva and the Mahabharata is essentially a governance lesson in the garb of a story. Okay. Or when Sugriv is telling his in the Ramayana is telling the Vanar Sena where to search for Sita Ma. When I remember when I'd heard it first time, I was 7 years old or something. I'd asked my grandfather. Everyone knew where Lanka was. Why is Sugriv describing, you know, yahan jao, west jao, north jao, east jao?
Geography.
Exactly. It's a geography lesson in the garb of a story. Right? So Ramayana, Mahabharata used to be taught on thing, and mathematics. There was a text called Leelavati by Bhaskaracharya, okay, which was written some 1000 or 1100 years ago. Bhaskaracharya ji was a brilliant mathematician, and his daughter Leelavati, apparently she hated mathematics, so he wrote a textbook for her, where he wrote Sanskrit poems, wonderful Sanskrit poems, and while reading an entertaining poem, you learn some of the theories of maths. Brilliant text. These 3 were the foundational ones. And then they specialize deeper into other subjects. Maybe we should just start with these. Ramayana, Mahabharata. And look, Ramayana, Mahabharata and Bhaskaracharya's Leelavati, I don't believe it's a heritage of just one religion. It's a heritage of everyone in the Indian subcontinent. We're all Indians. It's a heritage of everyone. Sorry, Subhashi, I can't hear you.
SG, you're on mute.
Amish, my question, my basic question again for my children, that as CC said, that is very important and imperative today, that we see that in the formative age of our children, they must understand the impact of mythology or these kind of epics or virtues and values. In this education system, what do you suggest? What are the first 4 things we must infuse in our children where they can really carry on their life in the future for 22nd century, 21st century or coming centuries? Because today you can see our children are very confused. Our youth is quite confused. A very disturbed one who really cannot understand whether I should respect my ancient books or values, virtues or narratives. So what are the 3-4 things you would like to suggest where our government, our society, our educationists must insist our kids to learn this first at the age of 8 to 10 or 6 to 10?
Very good question again. And one of the things our ancestors used to say is that as important as knowledge, in fact, probably more important than knowledge, is attitude.
Attitude, the intelligence.
So what are the key things that you should have in your attitude? One, I've said already, that accept that there are multiple truths. And your task is to try and learn as much as you can. That's the first point. Second point, one of the things that comes from our ancestors is that there is no concept of blasphemy in ancient India. Nothing is beyond question. There was no translation for the English word blasphemy in Vedic Sanskrit. Okay. The concept wasn't there, so the word wasn't there. Okay? Nothing was beyond question. So you can only learn when you're willing to question. Moment you say you cannot question, the learning stops. Okay. So in our way, faith was never considered bad. But faith which stops questioning is bad. Right? So for example, I have a lot of faith in Lord Shiva. That doesn't mean I will not question. Of course I should question. Why shouldn't I question? Right? You'll notice in the Indian way, there'll be a lot of people, I worship Lord Ram as well. Many people do. But at the same time, even those who worship Lord Ram will question that, he was a very good king, very good ruler, very good for his people. But, but we can say that did he treat Sita Ma fairly? Yeah, and we have a right. We are not disrespecting him by questioning. And that is the Indian way, that there's nothing wrong with questioning. This attitude, I believe, is not just a Hindu attitude, it's an attitude in the way every religion is practiced in India. Not just a dharmic attitude, which is Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. Not just a dharmic religion attitude, it's an attitude of every religion. I've said it so often, only an Indian Muslim could have said, ya to masjid mein sharab peene de Sakhi, ya aisi jagah bata jahan khuda na ho. Only an Indian Muslim could have said this. Because only an Indian Muslim could have come to, as you see in Venkateshwara Mandir in the south, where Muslims come and pray out there. You can Google those images. Muslim women in burqas coming and praying to Lord Vishnu. And similarly, Hindus will go to Ajmer Sharif, and pray out there. This is the Indian attitude where we are willing to accept different points of view and we are willing to question. The fourth thing that I think must be learned in the Indian way, you are responsible for your situation in life. In the Indian way, God doesn't decide what will happen to you. You decide with your karma, which means everything is in your hands. And in my mind, this is one of the most empowering statements to think. Okay, that we look to God for strength to carry on our karma. We don't look to God to manage our life. I have to manage my life. And if I take decisions, there could be positive consequences, there could be negative consequences. I have to be clear of that and I have to take charge. Which means no blaming anyone, no blaming society, parents, God. No. It's all mine. My decisions, my choices, which will impact my life, positive or negative. This is the Indian way. These few things should be taught as an attitude to Indians. This is our Indian way. And if we follow this attitude, there is no reason why we cannot recreate the India that was there for most of human history. You know, for Angus Madison, a British economist, had studied GDP movements over the last 2000 years. For the entire first millennium, first 1000 years, from 0 AD to 1000 AD, India contributed 35% of the world's GDP. US contributes only 23% of the world's GDP today. That time we contributed 35% of the world's GDP. From 1000 to 1700, we contributed between 25 to 30% of the world's GDP. For almost 85% of the last 2000 years, India was the richest country in the world. We've had a bad 300 years. And in those days, we were the biggest traders. We were the biggest scientific innovators. We were the toughest warriors, right? We were among our ancestors were kick-ass. And a lot of it was the attitude that they had. India has some 3 million handwritten Sanskrit manuscripts. You know, some British nonsense has been taught to us that ancient Indians didn't write. Absolutely untrue. There are 3 million Sanskrit handwritten manuscripts. That's more than the handwritten manuscripts of the rest of the ancient world combined.
Put together.
Combined. Our ancestors created more knowledge than the rest of the ancient world combined. This despite God knows how much knowledge being lost in Nalanda University, etc. We have to study it. We have to translate it. We haven't done it. It's our fault. Our generation's fault. But the point I'm trying to make is, why did our ancestors succeed so much? Because of their attitude. We were like the America of the ancient world. We were open-minded, liberal, confident. You know, we would accept immigrants from, abroad. But our attitude was very clear. We were the tough New York type liberals rather than the soft, weak California type liberals. Yeah. So, like, you come to India, but you have to respect our way of life, boss. You will not respect them, maar karke bhagayenge, jaise how we did to the Huns. Right? We have to learn those attitudes, the questioning attitude, love of knowledge, open-minded, confident, liberal. That attitude is the most important. Baki sab to ho jayega. Attitude is most important.
That is what I learned.
Very cool.
That is what I learned in my one life. I can say that through all mythology, the biggest line which impressed me till today, right from the childhood, Aham Brahmasmi. So can you give the importance of this line Aham Brahmasmi to the children of India? How they should think about their life.
Beautiful thought. Aham is me.
Brahmasmi.
Brahma, right? And Brahman, in this what is being referred to, Brahmasi, is not Lord Brahma as in the God of creation. Really? But Brahman, which is in the Indian way, is the source of everything, is the Nirgun Nirakar formless God, Brahman, right?
I am the creator.
Exactly. So, Aham Brahmasmi matlab I am God.
Attitude. Let's come to attitude, what you're talking about.
And you know, and in fact, this is what I showed in my books as well, Har Har Mahadev, that all of us are Mahadevs, right? And the concept in this is, you don't say I am God as ego. You say I am God as a responsibility, that I have to be worthy of this statement, right? That I am not looking at someone, at a God from a sad height, you know, sorry to paraphrase Dylan Thomas, but you know, to come down and save us. Okay, I look up to the gods and goddesses. I worship them. I learn from them. But Aham Brahmasmi, I am God, which means I will solve my problems. I will not just solve my problems. I will solve the problems of others as well. Right? That is what Aham Brahmasmi. It's not a question. It's not a thing of ego. It is a thing of complete responsibility, that I will behave like a God must behave.
In one of my films,
it's a very, very powerful thought, very, very powerful statement.
It reminds me, in one of my own film called Krishna, I had written a song. The first two lines were, Mujh mein Shiv hai, Mujh mein Brahma, Mujh mein Vishnu, Main kahe ko mandir jaun, Aham Brahmasmi, Aham Brahmasmi. You see, song there.
So we have lots of questions that have come in. I'm opening like literally 3 windows now in front of me. So, the first one, which I think is very interesting is, writing mythological or historical fiction requires rewriting facts and adding your own flavor. So as a writer, how do you decide how much to stretch the known information or the known facts while creating fiction? So, how do you know how much to pull at it in order to put it into a narrative?
Very good question, Chaitanya. And the key thing in this is let the story guide you. Okay. Look, in any task that we do, we have to have one locus, which is one core thing which we have to follow, right? So like, for example, if I was a scholar, my job would be to study the facts and make sure I stick to the facts and then put out whatever narrative makes sense of those facts. Okay. That is,
so you would study the principal texts.
If I'm a storyteller, my loyalty should not be to the facts. My loyalty should be either to the story or the philosophies that I want to convey through the story.
Okay.
So facts which blend into that story, great. Facts which need to be created to blend into that story, that is also great. As someone had said very wisely, the difference between fictional stories and real life is fictional stories have to make sense. Real life makes no sense. Okay, so you have to make sure the story flows. All right. So some facts fit in, some facts don't. Like in Braveheart, the story of William Wallace. There are some things which are facts, okay, in that, but some things which are clearly not. There is no way William Wallace had an affair with a French princess.
No way, yeah.
Who became the English queen, and his line carried on as the English king. No, boss, that is not what happened. Okay, but that fits into the story narrative, so they used it, right? It's the same thing that you stay true to the story and put in and to the philosophies and use facts which support it. What should your locus be? What should be the core principle on which you make decisions? It should not be facts. It should be the story and philosophy. If you're a scholar, it should be facts. If you're a storyteller, it has to be story and philosophies.
Okay. This is an interesting question, and it's surprised it's come from somebody who's 18. So, what are some websites and books that you would recommend that somebody would want to read, even if they're not being taught it in school or college? If they wanted to kind of read on their own, is there what would you recommend in books? And is there a particular hierarchy that you would recommend that, we know that don't start with the Upanishads because, it'll,
that's
you won't understand anything, right? So start with what's what's junior KG and then what's secondary school and what's 12th standard? What's the hierarchy of some of the stuff that you should start to look at as, somebody individual wants to do it?
So there's this very good author. He's based in London right now, but his heart is still in India, called Amish Tripathi. You should check out his books. But seriously, and you can of course read them. But how it works is, if the entire dharmic way is a graduation course, then the Ramayana and Mahabharata is the first standard. It's
Correct.
the entry. Yeah. So start with the Ramayana and Mahabharata, a good translation. Vivek Devroy has done a translation of the Valmiki Ramayana and the critical edition of the Mahabharata. You could start with that. Chinmaya Mission has done a good translation. Then you go deeper into the Puranas. Okay. Then you go deeper, say, into Brahmanas, Aranyakas, the Gitas. There are various Gitas. Huh? There's not just one Bhagavad Gita. There's a Ashtavakra Gita. There are various Gitas, right? Then the Lotus Sutra of Buddhism, the Vakyas of the Tirthankaras, Guru Granth Sahib. The graduation level are the Vedas and the Upanishads. Yeah. So as you said rightly, Upanishads, you need a guru to explain it to you. Those are hugely complex, and Upanishads are just pure philosophies. They're just philosophical discussions, right? But start with the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and there are good translations. Fortunately, in today's day, there are very good translations available in English or Hindi or whatever language.
It's another interesting one especially from a SEM 1 student. Kya baat hai? Okay. So there are, we, like in his family, he's been told about Shrutis and Smrutis, and, he's understood some of them. So can you explain, when he tried to explain to his batchmates, he couldn't. So can you talk a little bit about what are Shrutis and Smrutis, and if any of these narrative traditions or these ways of following have seeped into our popular culture?
Correct. Shruti is literally that which is heard. Smriti is that which is remembered and written down, right? That is the source word for it, but that's not the entire explanation. Shrutis are essentially the Vedas, okay? And some include the Upanishads in the Shruti as well. Some schools of thought. These are believed to have divine inspiration. So the Vedas have been written by rishis and rishikas. We had rishis and rishikas are like the equivalents of prophets, not exactly, but sort of equivalents of prophets and messiahs of the Abrahamic religions. So we had women prophets as well, by the way. The Vedas have hymns written by rishikas. So, I tell so many, I've said a few times today in public that there are some idiots who say women shouldn't read the scriptures. In our culture, they actually wrote the scriptures a few thousand years ago. Forget about reading the scriptures. They wrote the scriptures. Okay, so we had rishis and rishikas who had written Vedas and Upanishads. Those are the Shrutis. Those are supposed to be of divine origin, right? Which doesn't mean you can't question them, but they have a higher status because they're of divine origin, right? Smritis are essentially law books. Okay. These are not of divine origin. Okay. So the most famous one these days is Manusmriti. And for some reason, most people believe this is the only Smriti, which is not true at all. There are many, many, many Smritis. Yeah. For whatever reason, God alone knows why the British happened to pick Manusmriti and translated that. For most of India, actually, Manusmriti was not that big. Okay. And there were various Manus of different ages. Even that has to be understood. Now, there are other Smritis as well. Smritis are just law books. Okay, you should do this, you should do this. There's no philosophies in there. Yeah. There are Smritis like the Apastamba Smriti, Vyasa Smriti, Parashara Smriti, which are very liberal. Okay, very, very liberal. Liberal enough to shock even people in UK and US right now. And some Smritis are very conservative, like Manusmriti. So this is the differentiation. Having said that, the Smritis are not of divine origin at all. It's very, at the beginning of every Smriti, they say, this is the practices of human society today. Like the Smriti of our age, today's day, is the Indian Constitution.
Constitution, yeah.
The Indian Constitution is the Smriti of our age. That's a way to understand a Smriti. Okay, it's a law book. Law book created by, there's no divine origin in there. You don't like it, you change it.
Okay. So this has come from a writer. So in the film industry, there is something called suspension of disbelief in our films, right? So like in Amar Akbar Anthony, those two flames go from the god's eye to the mother's eye, and suddenly she can see, and all those things.
Or the blood from the three.
Correct. Yeah. Or like,
the mother,
or
which is medically impossible.
Correct. Or Ajay Devgan punches someone and he flies 10 feet, in the air, or that kind of stuff, right? So a lot of this suspension of disbelief is we just take it as normal because it's blended so well into the narrative. So, somebody is asking, a lot of our epics, how much of what is written is actually suspension of disbelief, because, it didn't really happen, but in order to give the characters value or grand or make them bigger or larger than life, just like we do with our heroes in the in films, how much of it was done to make them grander than they actually are, and how much of it sounds, is kind of logical? Because, while I'm reading it, I can understand that, say, someone like a Vaman, if you take from the Dashavatara, he grew his size so large that he covered the whole world, all three worlds with his feet. Sounds a little bit like suspension of disbelief. So, and have some of these epics influenced the suspension of disbelief in cinema?
The suspension of disbelief and adding of metaphorical things to represent some philosophies has been there in every culture, okay? Especially in ancient cultures, because when you can kind of create symbology, through that, right? And symbology which delivers a deeper philosophical meaning, okay? So, like for example, the scene in Amar Akbar Anthony of the three sons giving blood to the mother was to give a awe moment to you, कि
Ah,
but that was the point of it.
correct.
And Manmohan Desai ji, I'm sure when he conceptualized it, did not check with the doctor, is this medically possible or not? Because you would have told him it's not medically possible. Correct. But it was about delivering some philosophy. This is done in almost every culture, okay, all over the world. So in many of these stories, there is a core story, there is of course a core truth, and then things are added over time. Right?
Yeah, like in Subhashji's Karma, so in Subhashji's Karma at the end, this, Dilip Kumar, who's a relatively old guy because, he's retired and all, with a Sten gun, shoots an exact India map around
India. I remember that
around, if anybody's
around
Anupam Kher.
I saw it on a theater. I saw that scene in the theater. Everyone was applauding. Everyone was clapping. So there is a purpose to that. That symbology. Now someone can say, "Abey sala, that is not practically possible. Arey yaar, magazine mein itne bullets hote hain, blah 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 blah." But look, the point of a scene is not just about is it practically possible. It is about delivering some emotions.
Correct.
And what was the thing in that emotions that he is going to be held by India and Sala India ke aage mat badh. That was the point. And
it's patriotism, is nationalism.
The audience got it. The audience got it. The audience applauded. People would have said Bharat Mata ki jai. So the point got through. So that is one of the things that storytellers have to think of is, what am I writing a story for? Right? Am I writing a story to convey some emotions and philosophies, or am I writing a story to state some facts? Okay. I don't mean to belittle, different kind of cinema, but we've had art house cinema and we've had commercial cinema, right? Now, Prem Rog was a commercial cinema on a very important issue of widow remarriage. And we've had art house cinema also on it. Hand on our heart, let's say honestly, which movie had a greater impact, a greater social impact? Prem Rog or some art house cinema which some 25 people will watch in a film festival? Okay. Obviously Prem Rog, correct. But when Prem Rog had to be made, there are various things that had to be done to get the emotions across. Correct.
Yeah, completely agree.
So again, all I'm saying is, don't judge either way. Think from your perspective as a storyteller. What am I writing this story for? Is it to convey some philosophies? Is it to convey some emotions? Okay. Then I will structure the story accordingly. Yeah.
Nice. This is the last question. I think we've kept you now for an hour and 15 minutes now. So this is from two students, actually similar questions. Is, now that Suhail Dev is being converted to the audiovisual medium, and congratulations on setting up Immortal Studios. All the best. Hope it's as grand as your books are. Are you involved at all in the conversion from the written word to the audiovisual, especially since a lot of your written material comes from the audiovisual parallel world that you reside in? So, are you involved in that, and are you now approaching things differently?
Yes, I am. I am certainly involved, and it is, which is why I've set up this company. My elder brother is helming it, and I've hired an experienced guy called Aman Gurwada, who has some 14-15 years of TV experience. We've got good partners, into it. Macau Films and Casa Films, and we've actually formed a group to produce it ourselves. So I'm certainly involved in the script writing. I'll not write the script, but I'm involved in the, once the script is being written. In fact, I'm actually going through the the draft of the script right now. So I'm certainly involved creatively, and let's hope that a movie worthy of this great hero, King Suheldev, comes out. Because in my mind, he's a very inspiring hero. You will have noticed that when Modi ji made his speech at Ayodhya, when he was talking about Indian heroes who defended India against foreign conquerors, he mentioned only two names. One was Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. The other was King Suheldev.
Correct.
And these are very important figures who actually we don't learn enough about.
Yeah. Also, are you looking at on the northeast, the Ahoms, because they also.
I am. The Ahoms are, one of the things I always ask people that have you ever thought about it? How come all invaders to India came only from the northwest? No one came from the northeast.
East, because the Ahoms stopped everybody.
Because the Ahoms used to beat back everyone who came from there. Whereas on the west, there were Pathans who are individually very brave. No doubt about it. The Pathans are individually very brave, but for some reason, maybe infighting, whatever, they could never form a good army. Right? So they used to lose to every invader. The Pathans used to protect our northwest corner.
Correct.
And the Ahoms protected our northeast corner. Right? Ahoms beat back everyone. Pathans individually very brave, no doubt about it. But they used to lose to every invader. So that's why our invaders came mostly from the northwest. So Ahoms need to be studied. They were exceptionally brave people.
And
there's a general called Lachit Borphukan.
Yeah.
I have a story idea in mind for him. I intend to write that.
So the Ahom dynasty is actually much longer than either the Mughal or the Maratha. It actually ran parallel to the Mughal plus the Maratha dynasty.
Among the longest ever. They are longer than the Mauryas, longer than the Guptas. Only the Cholas have a longer reign, I think. Ahoms are some 700 years. They lasted. They lost only to the British finally, right? And the Cholas were there for 1,000 or 1,100 years, more. Yeah.
Correct. So thank you so much. We have tons of questions, but really, I don't know if we can hold you for longer. Subhash ji, you're on mute. You just need to unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions? Last question that you want to ask Amish, or should wrap up?
I would like to talk for another 2 hours. But I can always, we'll always look forward to have a more session with the students, because the way you simplify the whole thing, what have been a big questions in our younger mind, is a wonderful session. I'm sure that our students and our younger generation must have gained really the in-depth meaning of the mythology and the importance of our life today, and how we can take this life today with this, our connecting our mind to the ancient mind and carry forward to make our country better. Thank you Amish ji. आए बहुत अच्छा लगा और बहुत मजा आया. And see you again.
I request both of you to stay back for just 2 minutes, because we just want to do the scholarship bit. So before we finish, so I want to hand over back to Kabir.
I thought you are giving us check.
Sir, आप मुझे check देते हो, मैं कहाँ से आपको दूँ?
You stay here. अभी मन बनेगा करोड़पति का check मिलेगा कुछ.
Anyway, over to Kabir.
Thank you for that amazing session. Whistling Woods believes in encouraging students to strive and to excel in everything they venture out to do. Before we begin the next panel, we would request Meghna ma'am to say a few words about our scholarships and announce the scholarship winner for the Amitabh Bachchan Scholarship. We would also like Subhash Ghai sir and Amish Tripathi sir to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kabir. So Whistling Woods draws immense pride in the fact that our students, faculty, and staff take our CSR initiatives and social responsibility contributions seriously and observe it as an essential part of their lives. As Asia's largest film, communication, and media arts creative institute situated in the heart of Mumbai, Whistling Woods has a key role to play in social welfare of the city and ethical responsibility towards our environment. So as part of their academic journey with us, the students are encouraged to not just limit their learnings to the curriculum, but much more. Being future filmmakers and creators, they have the power to reflect their responsibilities to society, socially relevant content. So from women empowerment to child labor to organ and blood donation to drug abuse, tree plantation drive to Clean India campaign, gender sensitization to educating underprivileged students, it is admirable to see everyone at Whistling Woods contributes so beautifully. So I'm happy to announce, delighted to announce the winner of our Amitabh Bachchan Scholarship. I must add that this scholarship is thanks to Mr. Anand Pandit, who sponsors it every year. I think this is the 4th student that he sponsored. And this scholarship goes to the brightest, the best student of filmmaking. And this year, the winner is Saloni from Cinematography Department. Congratulations, Saloni.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am.
You're most welcome. We're sorry we have to do this virtually this year. It's a different feeling to be able to give you the check. The final check actually goes to Saloni today. Sorry. But thanks again, Saloni. You've been a great student. You've done so well. And that is why you have achieved the scholarship. And I wish you all the very best.
Thank you so much. I would also like to thank Rahul sir, SG sir, and all of you all for always supporting me so much. And Rahul sir has also been my faculty, and it's been really amazing. And I would also like to thank my department, my faculty, my HOD Ashwini sir, Krishnamurthy sir, Farida ma'am, Manoj sir and Venkatesh sir, and even all the other faculty members who have ever taught me, because I think every class I have attended has been so amazing, and they might even not remember my name. I might just be a student sitting in their class, but all those classes have been really, really very nice. And I would like to thank even student services, academics, and everyone who has ever been part of this journey for the past 2 years. And I really hope that they always continue to be part of my journey. So thank you. Thank you to all of you.
We will be for sure. And, I just want to add here that when we started Whistling Woods, it was very difficult for us to recruit students in a subject like cinematography. And now we are giving a scholarship to a student, a girl student for cinematography. So again, Saloni, wish you all the very best. Would you like to add something? Amish, Mr. Guy, would you like to just say a few words of encouragement to Saloni?
Subhashji, pehle aap.
See, scholarship is not a reward. It is a responsibility thrusted on a student that now you have to prove the rest of your life that you are going to do better, and innovate beautiful things for others. If you get scholarship, you become probably a leader for others, a thought leader for others. You see, so that is how the scholarship means. Scholarship does not mean the financial help. Scholarship means a responsibility to go ahead and make a mark yourself as a leader to inspire the younger generation, other people to work hard to make their life better. My congratulations, Saloni. God bless you. Keep it up.
Thank you so much, sir.
Congratulations, Saloni. Fantastic achievements. I mean, in cinematography is one of the most important departments in movies. It is an audiovisual medium, and you are the visual. So, so in all the very best, and looking forward to some fantastic work from you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Kabir, you can end,
Yeah. Congratulations, Saloni. That gives all of us, all the SEM 1 students in specific, a lot to look forward to. Thank you, sir, and Meghna, ma'am. Thank you, Amish Tripathi, sir, for coming. And thank you, CC, sir, for moderating the session.